Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's 2025 Mid-Caesar Summer Tropical Weather Update. My name is Andrea Berg and I am your host for today's webinar. I just want to go over some housekeeping items before we begin. We are recording today's webinar, so if you want to go back and take a look at anything we've presented today, a link to view the recording will be sent out probably by mid next week, if not sooner. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to message me through the chat feature that's probably located on the right-hand side of your screen. And we have reserved some time at the end of our presentation for any questions. So again, use that chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen to enter any questions you have for any of our presenters at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait until the end. So with that, I just want to quickly introduce our three presenters. We will begin today with Eric Jenks. He's one of our weather risk communicators for long range forecasting. We have Nathan Hamlin, also a weather risk communicator, primarily for long range forecasting, and Stephen Strum, our weather risk senior manager. So I am going to turn the presentation over to Eric.
Thank you, Andrea. We'll take a look at the 2025 tropical season so far to start our presentation. And so far, we have had 3 named storms this season to have occurred, none of which have been hurricanes, all have been just tropical storms. So 0 hurricanes, 0 major hurricanes. We have had 1 U.S. named storm make landfall. That is, of course, Chantal, which we'll cover in a bit here, but no hurricanes have made landfall. In terms of damages, we have seen just under 62 million of US dollars in damage so far from this tropical season. And this is the 4th straight year that we have had no storms formed prior to the start of June. First system of note this year that we had was Tropical Storm Andrea, and it did not do much. It formed just east of Bermuda on June 24th and became a mid-level tropical storm in the middle of the Atlantic. It caused no damage, no landfall whatsoever, and it dissipated fairly quickly. Our second storm that was a little bit more notable was Tropical Storm Barry, which formed on June 28th and lasted through the 30th after it made landfall in Tampico, Mexico. Maxed out at 45 miles per hour for winds, so a weaker tropical storm in terms of winds, but did cause nearly $6 million worth of damage and caused 8 direct fatalities, none in the U.S., all in Mexico. With this system, bigger issue was with rain, where North Padre Island saw upwards or saw gusty winds, rough surf, and Brownsville saw nearly 5 inches of rainfall with the system. The bigger story with Barry was its remnants down the long term, where it's helped cause historic flooding across portions of the Texas Hill Country, which we'll talk about in this following slide right here. And this occurred July 4th into the 5th, where the remnants of Barry interacted with a trough that would formed over the south central U.S., and that helped produce torrential rainfall over the Texas Hill Country. Saw generally 5 to 11 inches of rain that fell in a very short time span in the matter of a couple of hours. And with that, we saw the Guadalupe River rise 26 feet in less than an hour in 45 minutes. And in total, during the night of the 4th into the early morning hours, almost 35 feet overall in a very short time frame. This led to at least 135 fatalities as of this recording, including more than 37 children with all of the camps in the area in the Texas Hill Country. And there are still missing people in regards to this event. Third system that did make landfall in the U.S. was Tropical Storm Chantal, which formed on July 4th and then made landfall a few days later over the final week of the first week of July. Made landfall in Litchfield Beach, South Carolina, and this one caused upwards of $56 million worth of damage and included 6 fatalities in the Carolinas. Biggest contributor with Chantal was the rainfall, similar to Barry, where we saw upwards of 11 inches across portions of central North Carolina, and this led to historic flooding on the Haw River, which peaked at around 32 feet or so during when it's crested. Parts of I-40 had to be shut down in Alamance County, North Carolina, due to this flooding. In addition to the rain, there were a report of a EF1 tornado, which damaged 2 hangars and 2 aircraft at the Raleigh Executive Jetport. Switching gears over to climatology, you can see we're still in the early stages of the season. We'll see it gradually grow in stature as we go through August, and we'll reach the peak of the tropical season as we get towards around September 10th. So second week of September or so, that'll be the peak of the climatological season. Once we get by that, we will start to gradually decline as we go through the remainder of September and October. And by the time we get to November, we are out of the peak season at that point. In terms of named tropical storms and hurricanes by year, you can see the green represents tropical storms, the yellow is hurricanes, and the red are major hurricanes per season. And you can see that there's a noticeable trend with named storms at the very least in terms of increasing going over the past 30 years or so, where we had the average of sitting around 11, 12 tropical storms going through the mid 90s. And as we've from that point on, pretty steady climb up to now we're averaging the previous 10 years is closer to 20 overall. So very noticeable change through there. The change is not as noticeable though for hurricanes, and especially major hurricanes, where the average of around 6 to 7 hurricanes a year that we had back in the 50s is not much more. It's more closer to more of a 7 to 8 range in over the past decade or so. And same goes with major hurricanes, where on average, generally around 3 a year in the 50s, and we're still averaging close to 3 in current times. And a lot of that change for named tropical storms increasing, while the hurricanes and major hurricanes not quite so much. A lot of that's just due to improved technique for finding the weaker storms out further out in the Atlantic that was more difficult to do so back in the 50s. Now there's more resources to find those storms and be able to name them. In terms of U.S. hurricane landfall trends, generally on average you can expect just under 2 a year to occur. And this goes back to 1900. And for major landfalls, similar, you can kind of expect generally on average around half of a major hurricane each year. You can see though in the very short term that there has been a little bit of a spike over the past decade, where now we're up to just under 3 hurricanes a year with the most recent 10-year average, and then just over 1 major hurricane per year for the 10-year average. But you can see that's following a pretty slow period during the late 2000s and early 2010s, where we went over a decade where we did not have a major hurricane making landfall in the U.S. So some cyclicity to this, but it has been, in the very recent terms, there has been a little bit of an uptick. And that is reflected with our hurricane landfalls each decade dating back to 1850, where you can see a little more similar, just some cyclicity to it, and that's a lot of that is tied to the AMO. Positive AMO phase, which we are in right now, increased the odds for a landfalling hurricane. And you can see 2010, where it was a slower decade, we only had 13 named hurricanes make landfall in the U.S., whereas compare that to the 2020s, we have seen 15 occur already, and we're only halfway through the decade. And you can see on the right-hand side here the trends for where they landfall for the U.S. You can see Gulf Coast for hurricane landfalls in a given year. The mean is 0.7 for both positive AMO and negative AMO. But there's a little bit more of a tell for Florida and the East Coast, where a little bit of a stronger signal for positive AMO with the up to 1.3 hurricanes a year compared to 0.8 in the negative phase. And that leads us to about a half of a hurricane more for the positive AMO years compared to the negative AMO years. And similar to the major hurricanes, a slight uptick for the U.S., where it's maybe a tenth of a hurricane more for major hurricanes with the positive AMO compared to the negative AMO. Tornadoes spawned by tropical cyclones is also a concern. You can see they'll occur along the path of the cyclones or within rain bands. These accounts for about 6% of all reported U.S. tornadoes, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a strong system. It could be a weakening system that's well inland at the point. You can still see those tornadoes pop off within a rain band. Rainfall is also a significant threat, and you can see it's not just beyond the Gulf Coast. You can see, or where the landfall is. You can see where Harvey had 60 inches near the Houston area. You can go up to Kansas, Illinois, Indiana. You can still see in excess of 10 inches from a tropical system. So well inland, the extreme rainfall can still be a significant concern. So some important historical factors, we have seen no major hurricanes between October 2005 and August 2017 in terms of making a landfall, which is the record. Since that point, though, it's picked up quite a bit. We're up to around 11. We have 11 that's occurred since that time. The impacts from the storm can be located in the wrong place, can have disastrous impacts. So you can see storms like Sandy, storms like Harvey, even a storm like Helene last year with the rains in the Appalachians. The strong storm in the wrong place can have catastrophic impacts. As landfalls and intensities match up with historical distributions, costs will be much greater due to the growth of exposure, vulnerability, and property wealth, and this has already been observed since 2017. Landfall in areas of dense population and infrastructure increases the threat for widespread property damage and the loss of life. And then finally, there is some evidence for a recent trend for storms to stall out near the North American coastal areas, which would induce higher rainfall totals. And with that, I will switch things over to Nate, and he'll go through the seasonal forecast.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for all that great information. I have a lot to cover here, so I will get going here. Well, first things first, what makes an active tropical season? And tropical development is enhanced when the ocean temperatures are warmer than average, so that gives storms more fuel to work with. And we talk about wind shear, or in other words, how does the wind change with height? Well, if it's weaker than normal, in other words, the wind direction and wind speed is approximately the same near the surface as it is way up at the jet stream level, then that's very favorable. If it's not, if there's a lot of differences in speed or direction, then the storms tend to be less organized. And in the background, you like to see large scale rising air motion. If you have all those things together, it's the most favorable regime for tropical development. And let's zoom out a little bit. We talk about the main development region here on referred to as the MDR, which is off the west coast of Africa through the Caribbean Sea. And how we just talked about the favorable factors, but another thing we haven't talked about is the West African monsoon. So all the waves that come across the Atlantic have to come from somewhere, and they come off of Africa. And if you have a stronger, wetter African monsoon, that means more waves and stronger waves. And if you push them westward out over the MDR with favorable conditions, chances are you're going to have more storms. Well, let's take a look at the main seasonal drivers. And first thing we like to talk about with every single one of these presentations is ENSO. And right now we are in ENSO neutral, which means not warm or cool in the equatorial Pacific, just west of South America. But what's forecast to happen over the next few months is a gradual cooling. So we could have a potential weak La Nina by the time we get towards the end of the peak season. And on top of that, we like to look at further north. So at the Pacific Ocean, we look at the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and it's in its negative or cooler phase. And basically what that means is that there's warm water in the North Pacific with relatively cooler water along the west coast of North America. And then over on the Atlantic side, we talk about the AMO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. Eric made mention of why that is important. And basically what that means is that there's warm North Atlantic ocean temperatures, but it is noteworthy that it won't be nearly as warm as it was last year. Let's focus in on ENSO for just a moment. In the forecast through April 2026 from modeling centers all across the world, so you can see the average water temperature anomaly with all the different lines. And the maroon thick line is the model average. And that tips down right to about that La Nina threshold by the time we get towards the fall, the October, November, December frame, before gradually weakening. And whether it goes into La Nina or not, or just stays on the threshold, I don't think it'll be too material when it comes to this season, but it probably will end up down there somewhere, and I think that will make things a little favorable. And some of the numbers here back that up. So ENSO influence, if you look at all year since 1995, usually the average here is 16 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. But if we break that down by ENSO, you see all El Nino since 1995 is considerably less, 13, 5, and 3 respectively. But the neutral ENSO and the La Nina are considerably more. Now, the little numbers you see on each side are the max and min, so there's some variability within that. But overall, ENSO matters. When you have a neutral ENSO or a La Nina, it's typically more favorable for more storms in the Atlantic Basin. Let's take a look at some analogs based on the ocean temperatures we just discussed. And start with the historical average, the 30-year average, 1991 to 2020, and 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes of category 3 or stronger. And we apply the 1995 plus ENSO years we just talked about, 16.5, 7.9, and 3.6 respectively. So take those right away. Now we take a look at our analog averages when we include some of the other factors, and it's even a little bit higher. Average named storm 17.6, 8.1 hurricanes, 3.7 majors. So it is pointing towards a slightly more active season than usual. And let's take a look at some of individual storm tracks from analog years for this year. Take a look at years like 2021, 2001, 2012, etc. And a couple of things stand out. Number one, there's a pretty strong signal for storms to come across the MDR and then turn northward and recurve into the open Atlantic. Almost every single year shows a strong signal for that. Another thing that stands out is some activity in the Gulf of America. Note here that some of it is homegrown, like 2001. There's a whole bunch of them that ended up like that. 2012, the same thing. So there's a lot of close-in development risk in there as well. And the other thing that stands out is the Caribbean Sea is relatively quiet. Everything is far northern base if it makes it in there. So those are kind of the things that stand out when you look at the individual years. And we can composite all that into density anomalies, and this can tell a story too. So note here all these red numbers, these high numbers, you can see the recurving signature overall. A couple of different tracks, one that's pretty far out to sea, a quicker recurve, and then another one that makes it into the Eastern Caribbean before you get your recurve. And that could recurve relatively close to the Eastern seaboard. That's a little bit too close for comfort. And what that tells you is that we're going to have to watch that area overall as we get towards the peak part of the season. And the other thing you see is another maximum area of higher numbers and greater density over the Eastern Gulf into just off the southeast coast, and then the area in the Caribbean just south of Cuba. So that gives us the opportunity that some close-in development, especially in the Eastern Gulf. So, and we've already observed that opportunity already. Chantal is a good example of that. So more of that could be possible as we go forward, and that's the main story. And if we break it down by month, August here in the top left, September in the top right, the bottom left is October. This is the peak season. Now note here the opportunity for some long track storms, but there's a pretty low number, see 1s and 2s. And then of course the northeastern Gulf and off of the southeast coast is also favored. But one thing you note here is that there's not too many of them. So August could be relatively quiet. But if you look at September, that's when it really ramps up. A lot of recurving storms during that time, and you have a less of a signal in the Gulf, but it is painfully close to the eastern seaboard from the Outer Banks northward to even up into New England. So there's some signal for that during the month of September. And then you kind of get the idea that this recurving storm pattern could continue into October. But usually by that time, especially as we get towards the middle and latter part of October, you start to see the storm tracks or in the storm initiation shift from the MDR to the Western Caribbean, and that's what's being shown there. So those are the types of things that the analog patterns are telling us. Let's take a look at the current sea surface temperature anomalies. You can see some cooler water in the central tropical Pacific, but not really that cool. So it's still the ENSO neutral variety. But a couple of things. It is warmer in the MDR at the moment, but it's not nearly as warm as it was last year. And another little wrinkle here is we have a lot of warm water just south of Mexico in the northeastern tropical Pacific. And that is having an impact on the season so far. And another thing is having an impact on the season so far is Saharan dust imagery. Now we are having a stronger than normal West African monsoon, and it is kicking waves out westward. However, the other thing it's doing is it's picking up a lot of dust from the Sahara and then pushing it westward out over the MDR as well. And when you have a layer of dust, it tends to make the storm a lot less organized, and the air mass is drier in that layer. So it's very, very disruptive to tropical activity. So this has to be resolved. In a lot of seasons, this maximizes as we get towards July and into August, and then tends to die down a little bit. So we're going to be battling that for the next few weeks before we get to the peak part of the peak season. So wind shear, we talked about why that's important, and it has been an issue this year. Now we talked about all that warmer water in the northeastern tropical Pacific. Well, the impact that it's having is those thunderstorms. It's creating thunderstorms in that region, and those thunderstorm clusters are creating westerly winds that go over the Caribbean and into the MDR, and those westerly wind anomalies are creating lots of shear. Not only are they westerly wind anomalies, but they're actually westerly winds. It's not just weakerly trade winds or weaker trade winds. So that is very, very impressive. And just the graph on the right is showing where it's boxed in. All that blue is lots. That is indicative of lots of cloud cover. It did maximize during the spring season, but it popped up again in June and into early July, at least a week or so. This has been kind of a source of trouble, and that's why you haven't seen a whole lot of development outside of the close-in range. So will that go away? That's big. That's the $25,000 question. And if we look, let's ask the model guidance first. And in looking at the CFS forecast, you see the below average shear that develops over that very region, the MDR into the Caribbean. So the CFS thinks it will go away, and it notes that the shear should lift up towards the Gulf Coast and out off of the eastern seaboard. Well, let's ask the C3S model guidance here provided from Ben Knoll Weather. And that also shows a northward lifting. Note these shades of pink that are over the northern Gulf towards the Gulf Coast, and then the blues that are across the MDR. So the model guidance thinks that shear is going to lift up. And if that were to occur during August and September, of course, that is more favorable for developing storms in the main development region. However, if we take a look at our analog approach and during that August and September region, no, it doesn't shift. It does shift northward, of course, and we get the blues, which is below average wind, below average or above average trade winds, below average westerly wind anomalies. So that's favorable for development there. But note here, it's a little bit further south. It's more in the central and southern Gulf, and then off of the Bahamas, where the westerly wind anomalies will be. And so this suggests to me that the shear could last a little bit longer than what the models indicate, and that could kind of set our season back and maybe compress it more into the central and latter part of the August, September, October main development season, as opposed to having things get going right away in August. And another thing here that kind of concerns me is if we take a look at the ECMWF UK Met rainfall forecast super blend, we'll call it. It's not super impressive. All these brown colors, that means drier than average forecast here, and especially over the Caribbean. And note here the greens in the Gulf, so that is indicating the opportunity for more of that close-in development. And I think there will be some risk for that as we go through the month of August. But the other thing I want to call attention to here is the thick green here in that northeastern tropical Pacific. It's still there. So as long as those thunderstorms remain there, over that warmer water, we're gonna be having some shear problems across the Caribbean Sea, and I think the models might be a little bit too quick to move that shear northward. So that is going to be a risk and something that we're going to watch, and we're going to have to see if that is a little bit more early base that can go away during September, October. Maybe we can reduce the shear a little bit quicker, like the models say. So it is a difficult forecast, and it's not a slam dunk for an active season because of that. The ECMWF here is certainly picking up on that to a certain degree. No, this is what the ECMWF has forecasted this period each and every year since 1992, and from the August through January timeframe. And it is not very impressive with the 2025 forecast. No, it's at least almost 5 storms less than what it was forecasting last year. And this is the lowest ECMWF forecast since 2019. So that's pretty impressive overall. It should tell you that along with the shear opportunity, that we shouldn't be too aggressive with our forecast. So the summary here, ENSO neutral is favorable for tropical development, and analog years indicate that slightly above average tropical activity can be anticipated. Some warmer water in the MDR, but it is cooler than 2024, but that's still above normal. This just shows you how warm it was last year. And then there's a lot of warm water in the Gulf and then off of the southeast U.S. coast. So that's favorable for close-in development, and also favorable for rapid intensification of other systems if other favorable factors can line up simultaneously. Wind shear has been an issue in the Caribbean. The models and analogs do suggest that it will lift northward with time, creating a more favorable shear environment, but there is uncertainty. And all these signals put together so strongly suggest, I think, a slightly above average season could unfold, but nothing out of control like 2020 or 2005. Upper air patterns inducing landfall. Now, the quiet period that Eric spoke of earlier, we did have a trough of low pressure along the eastern seaboard with a big ridge off of the Canadian Maritimes. So when storms would come westward, they would be lifted up and do that recurving thing we talked about earlier. And here's all the systems that came during that time, and look how many of them were lifted northward and then northeastward, largely protected the U.S. coast from landfalling hurricanes. 2020 was a hyperactive year, and look at the difference. The low pressure area was further north, and then the trough was further west. Big ridge off, blocking high pressure off of the east coast. So these storms were forced to go further west before they could make their northward turn, and that made the Gulf a prime target. So you can see all the storms that happened in 2020, just an assault on the central Gulf Coast because of that. So what does that mean for this year? Well, there's that trough right there, right along the eastern seaboard. So that would suggest that recurving would be more likely, and that is definitely so. But if we take a look at this high pressure, it is off the Canadian Maritimes. It is of stout, and it is pretty far east. And sometimes that can block storms that are trying to recurve to the east. So maybe some of them, when they try to recurve northward, might not be able to escape to the east, and that would threaten the northeast U.S. So we'll have to watch that. And then, of course, we do have our close-in development threat I've noted here with this one red arrow. So those are the types of things we're watching during this season. Current tropical conditions, talked about close-in development. There is a little feature just off of the Florida coast that will drift westward over the rest of this week. There will be some risk of development. 10% we have at the moment, but we'll have to watch it to see if it can spend a lot of time over that warmer water. There is some opportunity. So heavy rainfall risk, regardless of development, could occur along the Gulf Coast as a result of this system. Take a look at named storms after August 1st in the Atlantic Basin. So every single one that initiated after August 1st since 1995. And there's a tight little group between 12, 13, and 15, 16, 17. So it's probably going to fall in there. 2025 should fit in. 05 and 2020 stood out with over 20 storms. Those are ideal conditions. We don't have that this year. So this 13 to 17 bucket seems more likely for our 2025. 4-week tropical storm potential. This is from the ECMWF. And a note here, week 1 through week 1, week 2, week 3, and even week 4. Note right along the eastern seaboard into the northern Gulf, there are some risks. So it is indicating that close-in development, but it also trying to potentially get something going in the main development region. A little bit later on, it has slightly higher risks, but this is not what we call a very active look. Again, here, look at all the greens in the northeastern tropical Pacific. That'll be where the most storms will be more likely. It kind of hogs things up. And the Caribbean here looks pretty quiet as a result. Subseasonal factors, we take a look at things like the Madden-Julian oscillation, the MJO, and they create areas of upward or downward motion. Where this green is, the ECMWF is forecasting upward motion. This is the second week of August, 4th to the 10th. However, if we fast forward here, I think downward motion is going to take over for the middle and latter part of August. And we take a look at the shear forecast, and note here where these red colors are, that is above average wind shear and it's hard to get away from it. So we go all the way into early August, it does weaken to a certain degree. So it shouldn't be as bad as it is now, but above average shear should be in there. And I would think that shear, especially early to mid-August, will be limiting potential for storms. And then downward motion for mid to late August will be a limiting factor as we get into that part of the month. So that's another reason why I suggest that maybe the storm season doesn't start as active as it could. So wrap it all up into a forecast. We're going to go for 19 named storms, 9 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes, which is slightly above average. We're going to highlight the recurving tracks off here in the Atlantic, and then of course right on the edge of the eastern seaboard. And we're going to highlight the potential off of the southeast coast and the central and eastern Gulf. Slightly enhanced risk there, but for the Caribbean Sea and Central America, below average risks overall. Here are the Atlantic storm names. So far we're through Chantal, we're waiting for Dexter, and hopefully we don't have to get too far through this list. So key messages, pattern indicators are not as favorable as they were in 2024. Analog patterns suggest there's a higher risk of close-in development in the northern Gulf and off the southeast coast, along with more recurving storms. Analog patterns suggest an above normal risk of a northeast mid-Atlantic impact, so that'll be something we'll have to watch as we get deeper into the season. Wind shear has also been a problem in the Caribbean and in the MDR this year, and if it can shift northward and weaken like the guidance and analog patterns suggest, then the peak storm period could be still pretty active, but the uncertainty is high on that, and I think the best chances of that will be in September and October. Anomalously warm sea surface temperature in the Gulf and off the southeast coast argue for potential rapid intensification of storms, along with the close-in development. And as we've seen already this year, even a weaker tropical cyclone can have a significant impact if it strikes a highly vulnerable location or moves very slowly. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen Strum, our senior manager, who will tell us all about other impacts for the summer and how it will impact you overall. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Nate. Now, having looked at the tropical part of the outlook, we'll go ahead and look at the temperature and rainfall outlook for the upcoming August through the fall season. And as you can see here, there's a lot of orange and red on the map really through the entire fall season through November. So overall, for the September to November time period, we are looking for most of the country to average warmer than normal. Notice though that the core of that warmth is located across the Plains region, whereas the East Coast and the West Coast are closer to normal. So in general, for the Eastern US, we do expect to see more variability in the temperatures there. Whereas across the plains, those areas there will likely see a much more persistent warm pattern through the fall season. But nonetheless, there are still going to be likely some periods of sharply cooler weather as we head into October, November across the central US. But those will be shorter lived and of overall less duration than the warm periods will be. And so we should still see most of the central US average warmer than normal for each of the fall months. Now looking at rainfall, there is a lot of dryness on the map. You can see pretty much we're forecasting most of the central and the eastern US to average below normal in terms of rainfall, but that is outside of tropical activity. Odds are we will see a tropical system or two make landfall somewhere. And obviously, wherever those storms tend to make landfall and track, there's going to be a swath of above average rainfall associated with them, but we can't predict exactly where that might occur. So the areas that are not directly impacted by tropical activity are forecast to see below average rainfall. But obviously, if you get a 20-inch swath of rainfall in a narrow corridor with a tropical storm or hurricane, those areas are going to end up averaging above normal in terms of rainfall for the fall season. But again, whether a storm might hit Alabama or into Georgia or somewhere else, we can't predict exactly where that's going to take place. And so as a result, just know that it's forecast to be drier than average for most areas, but wherever a hurricane or a tropical storm hits, that will likely end up above normal. Also notice though that many areas of the plains to the eastern Rockies are forecast to stay drier than normal as well after we get past August. And so with the dry conditions already in place there, the widespread drought, that is going to be setting up a regime for potentially an active fire season through the fall months across portions of the especially northern Rockies. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. First off, though, looking at the cooling degree day outlook for the summer season as a whole, notice that this year is pretty much in line with what we've seen the last decade or so. We're actually pretty close to the 5-year average in terms of population-weighted CDD. So this is not an extremely hot summer relative to some of the ones we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, but nonetheless, certainly on the warm side, for the past few decades, certainly. And a lot of it is just a lack of really intense heat, but kind of a widespread area of warmer than normal conditions across the country. So kind of persistent warmth to the hot weather, but not a lot of the real intense heat so far. And that will be the case in part because of all the rainfall we've seen this year across a lot of the plains region. That's really prevented the really strong areas of high pressure that we typically see in summer from developing early on. And that in turn has reduced the overall intensity of the heat so far this summer across the middle part of the country. Now, again, looking at those drought conditions across the western half of the country, pretty much everyone in drought to some extent, varying levels of intensity. And the forecast on the right does show that most areas should see either drought persist or drought expand and intensify across the western half of the country. So again, that is going to lead to enhanced wildfire risks. And if you look at the wildfire season here, again, the map on the left does show those wildfire risks for September, but also we are looking to see below average relative humidity across the northern Rockies areas. Again, those areas will also see at or below normal rainfall based on our current forecast. And so the combination of existing drought, drier conditions, low humidity, and above normal temperatures should promote a very active wildfire season, especially across the northern Rockies. And so we could see impacts from smoke and things like that downstream of there across the eastern US. Now, the monsoon has been fairly active across the Southwest, and so that may reduce the risks for wildfires in that area. However, with the monsoon thunderstorms, you do have a lot of lightning. And so especially around the periphery of the wetter areas where you have less rainfall, but you still have some of that lightning, that could be an instigator of additional wildfires in that region. So we'll have to watch that as well. Now, looking month by month here on the wildfire risk, notice that we tend to see the peak sort of months being August and September for the northwestern quadrant of the country, but then a reduction in the wildfire risk by October. And we are actually going to be looking at a potentially early start to the rainy season across the northwestern US this fall. And so we may see the wildfire season kind of come to a quicker end across that part of the country. However, notice it's kind of hard to tell there, but we do sort of see the peak month for wildfire risk in Southern California in the month of October, and that's related to the uptick in the Santa Ana winds we typically see at that time of the year. So California could stay active throughout the fall season, but we should see sort of a early season peak across the Northwest, and then as those rainfall totals increase during October and November, that should bring an end to the wildfire season across the northwestern quadrant of the country at that time. Now, severe weather has been a big story this year as well. We've had a very high level of tornado activity this year. And so, we're third so far since 2011 in terms of our tornado totals, and certainly widespread areas of hail and intense winds outside of tornadoes across the eastern 2/3 of the country, as you can see on that map on the left-hand side. Looking at just tornadoes and just severe wind, you can kind of get an idea of where those have been focused. Notice that tornadoes have really been kind of focused more from Alabama, Mississippi, northward up to the western Great Lakes. Not as much in the traditional plains area this year so far, but there has still been quite a few tornadoes in Texas and Oklahoma thus far. And again, a lot of severe wind events across the eastern third of the country from Illinois and pretty much areas eastward to the East Coast. So a lot of activity this year. We're not as active as, again, some of those very peak years, but certainly in that top tier for severe weather. Now, years that have been similar to this, like 2021, 2001, and 2013, did see a lot of severe weather linger right on into the fall season. And so we do expect that to happen this year as well. So during August and September, more severe weather likely, especially across the Midwest, Great Lakes to the Mid-Atlantic areas during the next couple of months. So summarizing the fall season overall on the West Coast, overall more seasonal, more of the persistent heat will be farther inland, and we likely will see an early start to the rainy season across the Northwest, but Southern California will be staying drier, and so we could see the wildfire risks there persist right on through the fall season. But across the Northern Rockies, where we do see that pattern of stronger warm anomalies, low humidity, existing drought, very high wildfire potential for the next couple of months, really through September. And then sometime in October, we should see that rainfall pattern increase in coverage and intensity and start to dampen the wildfire risks at that time. Across the southwestern U.S., we are seeing generally a more active monsoon pattern, and so that is keeping things wetter in some of those areas now, but the monsoon pattern likely will also wrap up earlier than usual this year, so we'll have to watch for drought to kind of re-expand again as we head later into the fall season. Across areas of the Western Great Lakes and parts of the Midwest, overall, again, a warmer than normal fall period, but there are going to be some potential shots of cold during October, November that could be pretty sharp, but likely just short-lived and not really having a big enough impact to keep any given month below average. Still severe weather risks, especially during August and September as well. Now, for the southeast and the northeast, we are going to be having to watch those tropical storm risks. Those recurving storms could potentially impact coastal areas of the northeast, and then we could see storms develop in the Gulf and, of course, track up into the southeast, impacting those areas as well. Again, we are forecasting the East Coast to be pretty close to average temperature-wise as we head through the fall season, and any of those stronger shots of cold could potentially bring some heavy lake effect snowfall across the Northeast as we get into November. The Great Lakes are very, very warm, and so if we do see any significant cold come in, you have a greater temperature difference between the lakes and the air masses that can really produce some copious snowfall. So we may not actually see a lot of events that are cold enough to produce lake effect snow, but the ones that happen could produce some very high snowfall totals, especially later in November. And again, some cold risks in the southeast as well late into the fall season. Now, looking at the renewable energy side for solar and wind, in general, with that warm pattern across the country, it is going to result in, for the most part, a more sun than average as well for much of the country. So above average solar power production likely going to be in play for much of the country outside of the Northwest. Now, the Northwest is shaded there as below average, but that's mostly because of the mid-October to November time period. September should actually see heightened or clearer than normal conditions across that area. Now, wind speeds, for the most part, not a huge signal either way for below or above average winds in general, near to slightly below average winds for much of the central and eastern U.S. based on our current outlook. So the key message is, again, it's a hot summer this year. It's not, the top tier of hot summers that we've seen in some of the recent years, but certainly still solidly above average and not too far from the 5 or 10-year average in terms of population-weighted CDDs. There is a lot of humidity this year. We've had a lot of rainfall in places. And so even though the actual temperatures maybe aren't quite as high in some areas as the last several summers, the high humidity values are creating some very high heat indices that kind of offset that to some extent. And again, with all the humidity and the warm water in the Gulf and off the East Coast, there's a lot of moisture available in the atmosphere and moisture that can be pulled off those surrounding ocean areas. And so the potential is for some very heavy rainfall anytime we do see a system come through that can produce rain. And so these thunderstorm events that happen will potentially continue to be very, very heavy rainfall producers during the balance of the summer and into the fall season. Again, the wildfire risk across the Northwest will likely become a bigger story as we progress forward in time here in the coming weeks, and still some severe weather risks going forward here for the next couple of months across the Midwest. Now, looking farther ahead into the winter season, our first preview of the upcoming winter outlook. And right now we are forecasting some below average temperatures across the upper Midwest, Northern Plains, Northern Rockies area, with, for the most part, the Gulf and East Coasts averaging warmer than normal for the upcoming winter. Notice, though, that the potential for widespread cold is kind of highest in January across much of the country, and potentially the coldest weather for the central and western U.S. happening during February, with more variability for the East Coast. So overall, not really too dissimilar to some of the last few winters in terms of temperatures. Likely the pattern will feature a lot of warm periods that are, pretty anomalous, but likely a couple of periods of some pretty intense cold that might last for a couple of weeks as well. So a lot of variability this winter is expected. Some extreme cold days, some extreme warm days for many areas, especially across the middle part of the country. Rainfall, or at least precipitation anomalies, looking to average above normal across the Northern Rockies, where we do have a lot of drought now. So that will be a helpful factor for them going into next year, and also above average precipitation from the Ohio Valley up into the Great Lakes, but below average for California and much of the Gulf Coast areas. Now, in terms of heating degree days, this year is currently forecast to come in pretty close to what we saw last winter, as well as winters like 2020, 21, and 21, 22. So, those are 3 recent years that could be a good proxy for this upcoming winter in terms of the overall heating demand that we are currently expecting to see. Now, if we do see a little bit more of a neutral ENSO pattern this winter, and perhaps La Nina development is slower or weaker, that could potentially increase our overall risks for more widespread cold as we head through the upcoming winter seasons. Now, looking at some industry impacts for the balance of the summer through the fall, again, on the utility side, a lot of widespread heat for the remainder of the summer season. So again, above average heating demand. That's been typical for most of, some recent summers here. So nothing too unusual there. And again, the intensity of the heat is not extreme, but just a lot of widespread persistent warm anomalies. Still a lot of severe weather risks for the upper Midwest, especially into the Great Lakes area, and that will continue to be a problem right on through September. And obviously, tropical storm systems, wherever they make landfall in the Gulf or the East Coast, will have some major impacts wherever they occur. And so that will be, as usual, every year, a big focus as well. Now, on the aviation side of things, again, that upper Midwest area where we are likely to see the most severe weather will likely have the greatest impacts on aviation. We have a stronger jet stream in that area as well, which will be impacting flight times. And the combination of the stronger jet stream and the frequent thunderstorm complexes across those areas will also create a lot of days with higher than average turbulence as well. The monsoon in the southwest could also have some impacts in area airports in that region as well, with a lot of afternoon and evening thunderstorms many days during the next couple of months. Now, certainly, anytime you have a lot of heat and a lot of humidity like this year, that's going to have a big impact on outdoor events. So everything from golf tournaments to high school events going through the next couple of months, certainly having a big impact from the heat and the humidity. And again, all the lightning associated with the thunderstorm complexes across the Great Lakes, Midwest area will likely have an impact on many outdoor events as well. And certainly, obviously, the tropical impacts are always there every year. And that will, of course, once again, be a big concern for many areas. Now, offshore, one thing we'll have to look at this year that is a little bit different than some of the other recent years is that we do look to see a lot of recurving storms in the Atlantic this year. So a lot of storms going northward off the East Coast into the North Atlantic, off towards perhaps northwestern Europe. And so a large swath of the Atlantic basin could be impacted by some long-lived tropical systems as we head through, especially late in August through October. And that could have a big impact on shipping across the Atlantic during the next few months. And obviously, anything that develops in the Gulf and impacts port areas there will have a big impact on as well in terms of delaying ships getting into port and that kind of thing as well. So overall, again, to summarize here before we go to questions, an active hurricane season this year, nothing extreme, but 19 storms, 9 hurricanes, 4 majors, and certainly another above average temperature pattern for the fall season, September through November. But notice again, the East Coast closer to average. So we could see more variability and potentially some additional or more cold days than we've seen in some of the recent fall seasons across parts of the eastern half of the country. But again, overall, a warmer than average fall season and a drier one as well for most areas outside of any areas that do see direct tropical storm or hurricane landfall impacts. And so with that, Nate, do we have any questions that have rolled in so far?
Well, we got a couple, but please, everybody, if you feel free to ask any questions, drop them in the chat and we'll get those answered here over the next few minutes. But we'll start with a couple here. Maybe this one's for you, Steve. What do you think the odds are of a derecho event across the Midwest? It seems like the opportunity, a lot of rainfall up there, maybe some thunderstorms. We talked about severe weather, but do you think this could maybe one of those could organize into a derecho event, be more impactful for a lot of people?
So yes, in summary, with the above or stronger than average jet stream along the Canadian border, northern U.S. area, the pattern that favors severe weather across the upper Midwest, Great Lakes area this year, everything is sort of there to have one of those develop. And so, as we go through August here, you may find a day or two here where we do see a pattern that's pretty favorable. Right now, for example, we have an upper level ridge across parts of the central US helping to build some heat there. Anytime you get that central US ridge in place, and again, our fall outlook also favors that to be a frequent pattern that we'll see, you tend to get that northwesterly flow pattern across the upper Midwest into down towards the mid-Atlantic. And with the pattern that we have with the jet stream and everything else, that would be a favorable setup to get a derecho event where we do see one of those complexes organized into a long-lived high wind event that could sweep down from the upper Midwest down, into the Ohio Valley or Eastern Great Lakes area. So we'll definitely have to watch that. Obviously, those can be extreme events when they happen. They don't always happen, and it's this kind of based on how everything comes together on a given day when we do have a severe weather outbreak develop. But definitely the ingredients are there for that to happen again this year.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's a risk we're all going to have to watch. Now, another question that came in, this has more to do with late season storms. Do you see any risk for storms later in the season, maybe even into December? I'll take that one. This year, I mean, you can never rule it out, especially this far in advance. You never know how the subseasonal, end of season will line up if you'll have the exact right ingredients to get a storm that late. But a couple of things I think might mitigate that risk to a certain degree. First of all, the waters in some of in the MDR and even into the Caribbean to a certain degree is a little bit cooler than 2024. So as we seasonally cool through the fall, it'll become less and less favorable with time. I think that will reduce the risk to a certain degree. And the other thing is if we get some of these cooler shots later in the season, as advertised by some of the analogs and even some of the guidance, will bring a cooler and more stable air down into that region. So if storms were to try to come up into that, they would encounter shear and they would be a bit less organized as well, even if they were able to form. So this year, I would think there would be a more of a risk. It'd be a kind of a lesser risk than normal of that happening. But that said, we can't rule it out, especially in November. All right, we do have another question here. With Western Canada projected to be above normal in the temperature department this fall, is it possible to have a dud winter similar to what we saw in 2001, 2002? Western Canada did have a similar fall back then. So how do you think that plays in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a year that we're looking at for similarities to this year, and so it kind of depends what you're also calling Western Canada. Certainly, I think British Columbia especially has less risk for cold overall this winter compared to the Canadian prairies. So if you're looking east of the Canadian Rockies, I think the risk for more significant cold is higher this year. But I think like the U.S., it is likely going to be a winter in those areas where we do see a couple periods this winter where we see a lot of extreme cold, but the time periods in between those could be highly anomalous on the warm side as well. So how all that balances out is a little bit tricky to say, but I think that we'll probably see one, if not two of the months this winter see some pretty meaningful cold that's notable for those areas, and probably those months average at or below average across at least areas east of the Canadian Rockies. Again, as you go Canadian Rockies to the Pacific coast, those areas are less likely to average below normal, I think. But if we're talking like eastern areas of Alberta, east of the Rockies and that kind of thing, then I think those areas, decent chance for at least 1 or 2 months this winter to see a below average for those months. And but again, a lot of variability this winter. I think the warm period is going to be pretty notable in terms of the warm anomalies, but a couple periods of cold this winter could be pretty significant as well. So that's gonna be kind of, I think, one of those things where you have like 3 or 4 weeks of strong warm anomalies, then you get a 2-week period where it's just extremely cold, and then you go back to a warm regime again that will be pretty anomalous. So I think overall, though, we are going to see enough cold though east of the Rockies to have a below average month or two this winter season that could be notable.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's certainly the screaming message as we approach the fall at this early stage when trying to look at the winter for the, I won't say the first time, but relative first time. We have one more question, a little more. It's a weather-focused webinar. Do we have any comments on the reported increase in seismic activity and the Pacific Rim of Fire? I don't have a lot on that. Do you have anything on that, Steve?
No, I mean, it's something that I look at in terms of just personal interest, that and volcanic activity and things like that, which can have a bigger impact on weather, certainly. If we do see a notable volcanic eruption, in the high latitudes, that can have an impact on the polar vortex and things like that. But I don't have anything really to add for at this point in time on if we'll see any weather impacts or just anything unusual and note. It's one of those things where a lot of times these increases, over time, there's been an increase that, you can see in the data, but most of that is because of better monitoring. And so trying to determine whether something is anomalous is hard to do when you don't have a lot of meaningfully good data, a few decades earlier from now. So yeah, I don't know that there's anything that's highly unusual this year relative to the, longer term history, that if you go back over the last 100 years, just because the data is so much better now than what it was even 30 years ago. A lot of that is it's really hard to make any kind of accurate comparison.
Yeah, that's a good point. So stuff like this, it's very hard. It's such a small sample size of years that we really knew what was going on. So it's very difficult. Yeah, I'm sure there will be some impact, but the more you increase it, will add something to the system. It's just kind of difficult to tell exactly how this level of activity will contribute overall as we get deeper and deeper into the fall and winter season. So we'll be certainly monitoring it as we go. And with that, I think we've reached the end of the line for questions. With that, we'll send it back over to Andrea. She can close this out. Wait a minute. We have one more question. Unless we have a couple more minutes, we'll take it. What is the difference between a major storm and a named storm? When we talk about hurricanes and typhoons, the difference, a named storm is something that's tropical storm or stronger in strength. We talk about a major system, like a major hurricane, that's category 3 or higher in strength. So usually you associate the major hurricanes with more destructive winds, higher waves, stronger storm surge, and things like that. So that's why they're highlighted, because they're anomalously dangerous storms, especially if you're anywhere near them. Even could be a little bit further away, they can be very impactful. So we try to reserve such a name like major for something that could be very dangerous and has to be monitored closely. I hope that helps answer that question. And with that, I think we can send it back to Andrea to close out the webinar for today.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric and Stephen and Nate, for a really informative webinar. Like I said, when we kicked off, we have recorded this webinar, and we will send out a link to the recording either by the end of this week or early next week. Please look forward to our next seasonal outlook webinar, which we will cover the winter season in October. So invites for that will go out. If you haven't already registered for it, you can register for it in the same location where you registered for this one. But specific direct invites for that October webinar will be sent out closer to that date. So with that, have a great rest of your day to everyone, and we'll see you all in October.